February 2020, and subsequent news reports and events emerged, that the full implications began to unfold. This report triggered a crash in global equity prices, with a dramatic 35% drop over just a few weeks. This tumultuous period continued until the situation stabilized and markets were reassured that policymakers, including central banks worldwide, stood ready to prevent a massive crisis in confidence. The public health measures that were implemented inevitably led to large contractionary forces, primarily supply shocks with substantial inflationary implications. As countries transitioned into the opening up phase, we also faced the challenge of managing expansionary forces on the demand side. Our central objective throughout this period was to prevent long-term inflation expectations from ratcheting up. Indeed, one of the lessons we learned from 1970s, explicitly incorporated into the development of Mark I frameworks, is that shocks like this are proximate causes of inflation. Monetary policy is ultimately responsible for determining whether these shocks become persistent and get entrenched in underlying wage and price setting behaviors and long-term inflation expectations. In Armenia, the COVID crisis was followed by a successive layering of crises, including geopolitical confrontation that presented unprecedented challenges for us. The Central Bank of Armenia's response during this crucial or critical time could almost be described as one of those least regrets. Learning from the international experiences of 1970s and recent stagflationary challenges faced by other countries, we adopted a proactive stance. Our economy's sensitivity to these shocks necessitated a tighter monetary policy stance to ensure that we avoided what Olivier Blanchard has termed dark corners where danger lurks. These dark corners include situations of great macroeconomic instability, such as allowing inflation expectations to become de-anchored. Our decisive actions were key in navigating these unprecedented times. At the same time, while we adequately dealt with these risks and helped avoid these dark corners of macroeconomic or policy instability, this unforgiving succession of crises forced us to sit down and ask a very fundamental questions about the nature of good policy making and good frameworks. Amid such high uncertainty, how could one develop a single interpretation of what was happening and forecast that future with any degree of legitimacy? What type of communications would effectively convey the richness and complexity of our policy discussions without minimizing the uncertainty we're facing or limiting our policy agility? What is monetary policy fundamentally about? Is serving as an expert forecaster of the most likely future, or most effectively managing the high degree of risk and uncertainty that is always at the core of policy making? This line of thinking led us to develop FPAS Mark II, an evolution of existing best-in-class monetary policy-making frameworks to better address what we believe to be the greatest policy imperative of our time, appropriately and systematically dealing with risk and uncertainty. I note that good frameworks aren't just about processes and policies. Robust frameworks that stand the test of the time require serious investment in institutional capacity building, most importantly in the standards we set out for our people, teams to operate them. Let me now complete my remarks by outlining the organization of the day. Vahe Avagyan will lead off and talk about the major elements in our prudent risk management approach, including how it has transformed the quarterly production process at the Central Bank of Armenia. We will also discuss how the staff interacts with the board to produce the best monetary policy report. His presentation will highlight the importance of human capital and how FPAS Mark II emphasizes productivity and embeds economics in the design of every issue relevant for considering the three essential ingredients to our policy. Question number 1, where is the economy today? Question number 2, what are the underlying forces? And last but not least, and of course, what do we need to do with our instruments to achieve our objectives? To illustrate this, he will provide an example of non-traded sticky prices, which we believe offers a better proxy for price stability and organizes our thinking about the monetary policy transmission mechanism. We're very pleased to have Charles Goodhart and Athanasios Orphanidis join us. Charles will discuss his agreement with our approach to providing scenario-based forward guidance. However, he raised valid concerns about how journalists and politicians might continue to demand baseline projections. Our objective is to address this issue by demonstrating that we have a richer, more effective approach, more aligned with the reality of making monetary policy under uncertainty. Athanasios will then discuss the role of simple rules, not as things that policymakers want to blindly follow, but that policymakers can use as a frame of reference to describe why they are not following simple rules. We also welcome Deputy Governor Ekaterina Mikabadze from National Bank of Georgia. Her insights will be particularly valuable given the similarities and differences in our respective monetary policy frameworks. With FPAS Mark II, we emphasize individual accountability on the board, a principle that also holds significance in Georgia's monetary policy framework. It will be enlightening to hear her perspective on how these frameworks operate in different institutional contexts, especially under a governor decision-maker model, that of Georgia. I'm also delighted to welcome Yuri Shasford, if I pronounce the surname correctly, from Money and Macro, who will focus on the importance of monetary policy communication. His expertise in the area of communications and improving economic and financial literacy will shed light on how effective communication strategies can augment the impact of monetary policy, particularly in an environment marked by complex economic challenges and uncertainties. As we proceed with the symposium, each presentation and discussion is geared towards deepening our understanding and enhancing our approaches to monetary policy in the face of global economic complexities. This symposium is not just a platform for sharing knowledge. It is a confluence of ideas shaping. Thank you once again for your participation and contributions. Let us embark on these 2 days of rich discussion and learning with the aim of advancing our collective knowledge and practices in the realm of monetary policy. Thank you, and I'll pass the floor to Vahe.
Thank you, Governor. So I'd like to begin this presentation by kind of setting the ground rules a little bit in terms of what we're going to be discussing. And I think the Governor really laid a lot of the kind of conceptual underpinnings for our framework and really mapped out the overall process of how we got here. And he also mentioned, of course, the fact that frameworks are very kind of complex systems by their nature, and that they include a number of different kind of complex facets. And so we're going to go through this presentation in the hopes of giving you a better understanding of the framework at large, and kind of at a high level looking at some of the specific aspects of the framework, but of course recognizing that we're going to be leaving a lot of things out. And so some of our sessions later on throughout this conference will be covering some of these issues in detail. For example, tomorrow at noon Armenia time, we have a session dedicated to human resources. So we'll be talking about some of the human capital issues there. And of course, throughout the conference, we'll be touching upon some of the more specific elements as well. But to begin, as the governor mentioned, we, over the course of the past few years, certainly for as long as economics has been a profession, but certainly over the course of the past few years, we in Armenia and around the world have been faced with, I think as the governor termed it, an unforgiving kind of succession of crises. And those crises that we face, and we face these types of things all the time, but in particular, I think in a condensed fashion over the past 3 years, kind of forced us to sit down and ask very fundamental questions about the essence and nature of what monetary policy is about, what we're hoping to achieve when we conduct monetary policy, and how we might set up our institutions, our organizations, and our people to better be in service of this mission. And so when we think about what the purpose of monetary policy is, and we've really distilled this into probably the most kind of simplistic point of view, but I think it's important to ask these kind of rather elementary seeming or fundamental questions about this question. First, whenever we're kind of confronted with any type of situation, our job as policymakers is to first and foremost very soberly analyze the risks that we're facing. And in doing so, we then start with our analysis and try to understand where the economy is today, what the driving forces are, and where the key uncertainties lie. Given that assessment, that understanding, right, this is kind of a fundamental essence of how we approach economic analysis under kind of FPAS type frameworks. Our job then as policymakers and decision makers is to do whatever is necessary to bring inflation back to target and to stabilize the economy. The most important kind of caveat or kind of extension of this idea is that the essence of good policy fundamentally is about avoiding sliding into dark corners. That's the term by, of course, Olivier Blanchard, and that includes things like dangerous nonlinearities. This is, if we allow as policymakers the economy to enter into these situations, it can become very, very costly for us to then steer the economy back to stabilization. This can have very serious adverse kind of welfare outcomes for society at large. And these are, of course, things that we want to avoid first and foremost as socially responsible and accountable kind of public sector institution, but also making sure that we're doing our job well. And so in thinking of kind of monetary policy within this formulation, which I think is very much kind of aligns with how a lot of people conceptually and logically think about what the role of monetary policy is, this naturally leads us to the formulation of thinking of monetary policy as an exercise in risk management. So given this kind of intellectual background, I'm sure, again, like I mentioned, is quite straightforward and aligns with how many people think about this issue. The question then becomes, how do we design a framework within which we conduct and make and communicate monetary policy that does the following three things? First, that it addresses this issue of uncertainty in monetary policy making. This issue of uncertainty is something that we recognize as being a fundamental, essential, unavoidable aspect of the work that we do when we are dealing with the economy. Second, that shifts the focus of policymaking away from this idea of trying to be an expert forecaster of the most likely future and trying to optimize the policy path for that most likely future to a different kind of formulation, which is ensuring more policy agility and the ability for us, while maintaining and preserving our credibility, to have policy agility in times of great uncertainty. The last thing, which touches upon that kind of most important lesson from the prior slide, is that we want this framework to recognize that important nonlinearities can kick in, and they can drag the economy towards dangerous dark corners. These might include things like the effective lower bound, getting stuck in a low or high inflation trap, on that latter point, allowing inflation expectations to become significantly de-anchored, and thus putting ourselves in a situation where our credibility is at stake. And of course, with credibility once lost, it becomes very difficult for us to regain. So designing a framework from the ground up that allows us to kind of have these three kind of essential ingredients in play is very important. Now, when we talk about monetary policy making frameworks today, we of course didn't start with nothing. So we of course owe a lot in terms of the existing frameworks that are in place that are considered gold standard today. The Central Bank of Armenia before this, of course, adhered to the first generation of the Forecasting and Policy Analysis System, or FPAS for short. This was, of course, developed in the late 80s and 90s, primarily at the Reserve Bank of New Zealand and the Bank of Canada, in response to a lot of the lessons learned from the Great Inflation of the 1970s. And of course, some of those lessons learned that was then taken and attempts were made to institutionalize that within a broader systematic approach to making monetary policy and communicating it. This is very important because what some of the novel features that were introduced as part of the original FPAS frameworks, I think, have gone a long way in terms of improving how we make and communicate monetary policy. These include things like a well-defined target for inflation, where policy is intended to guide expectations, including endogenous, objective, consistent paths for policy, while also emphasizing its forward-looking nature. And lastly, and this is one of the more important innovations of the original FPAS, is this idea of having a systematic and transparent communication of policy, where we move away from this idea of there being kind of doctors knows best or kind of a black box of how policy is made and trying to surprise markets. We're actually introducing a systematic and forward-looking, transparent manner for communicating policy. And this goes a long way also in kind of ensuring and setting the foundations for our accountability and also central bank independence. Of course, very important aspects when we're thinking about these things. So with this kind of context in mind, right, these frameworks certainly served us very, very well and incorporated, like I mentioned, a lot of the lessons learned from kind of the previous great inflationary period that we faced. But as we kind of entered into this period of the 2020s, and like I mentioned in Armenia, the successive layering of shocks that we faced, first the COVID crisis, then followed by significant kind of geopolitical turbulence, it became very clear that the existing frameworks, while they might have served very well along that journey of kind of improving how we make and communicate monetary policy, they might perhaps fall short in a number of key areas. And those areas where they fall short, I think, represented for us kind of a light bulb moment for opportunities to really revamp how we approach those key issues. So what are the places where these frameworks fall short? First and foremost, we find that there's a lot of attention paid to linear models and an overemphasis on the act of modeling itself, modeling as the ends rather than the means, rather than paying attention in particular to the economics that underlies the models. Of course, within our framework and how we think about things, modeling plays a very, very important role, but we think it's important to be very sensible about it. And one of the areas where kind of standard approaches to these technical models fell short is their kind of how they pay insufficient attention to dangerous nonlinearities. And these include things like endogenous policy credibility, things like a nonlinear Phillips curve. These are importantly things that we incorporate into our nonlinear models that we'll be talking about in a moment. And then the second point is this idea that economists oftentimes, and certainly policymakers, tend to fall back on their decisions or their explanations using language like the model says this or the Kalman filter says this, as opposed to the more kind of sensible and healthy idea, which is kind of the original way that we all want to be thinking about models, which is they're tools to help us kind of support good economic thinking. So our focus, first and foremost, is on the economic thinking, and the models are a tool to help us support that. We'll come back later on in the presentation to talk about kind of a specific example of how we actually treat these kind of analytical tools within our framework. The kind of more fundamental kind of communications related aspect of the existing frameworks really has to do with this issue of the baseline scenario. So the original research that really kicked off our new framework was a paper that was published in October of last year, which was titled FPAS Mark II, Eliminating the Folly in Baselines and Local Approximations. So the local approximations bit we talked about, but the baseline bit is very important because we find that a baseline scenario, when it's used as the primary vehicle for central bank communications, actually can create a lot of self-imposed traps for us. First, I think one of the issues with the baseline scenario is that it tends to assign a false sense of assurance, whether we intend it or not, to the baseline as this representation of a most likely future. Of course, there's a lot more nuance in terms of how we internally tend to think about what the baseline scenario is and is not. But when we think about how the public tends to perceive or external stakeholders tend to perceive that baseline scenario, that nuance is often lost. What is more important is that the baseline focuses us on centering on a single interpretation of a highly unlikely future, of a highly uncertain future, excuse me, and also a lot of uncertainty about the current economic environment itself. So when we, in times of kind of significant uncertainty, and when we think about this, a number of periods from recent years might come to mind, but for example, the kind of early inflationary period following the COVID crisis might come to mind, where it's very unclear and uncertain about how, what was actually driving the inflation, where was, the economy at that exact point in time, and then where might we be headed. There's a significant amount of uncertainty in terms of where that's going. And so centering on this single baseline view tends to kind of mask that uncertainty in a way that we don't want to do that. And it puts us in a self-imposed kind of trap that limits our policy agility moving forward, such that when we find that our interpretation that we've been arguing in a baseline scenario proves to be false, or proves to perhaps unfold in a way that was different than what we were previously communicating, we find that our hands are kind of tied, and it becomes much more difficult and costly for us to kind of switch gears and argue for a different interpretation than what we were previously saying. So this, again, the key idea here is that the baseline scenario puts us in a self-imposed bind. So is there a better way, perhaps, for us to be thinking about kind of quantitative forward guidance under these frameworks rather than this singular interpretation? So before we turn to that, I wanted to kind of mention one of the kind of intellectual underpinnings for this work. So we mentioned that this kind of formulation, that succession of questions that we talked about early on that got us to thinking about this idea of monetary policy as risk management, a lot of this is rooted in ideas that have existed in the world of policymaking for many years. And so our framework of FPAS Mark II represents an attempt to actually institutionalize and operationalize this idea within a framework. But this idea, I want to read this quote by Alan Greenspan that goes back to 2004, if I'm not mistaken, at Jackson Hole, where he says, the NPRM approach emphasizes understanding as much as possible many sources of risk and uncertainty that policymakers face, quantifying those risks when possible, and finally assessing the costs associated with each of those risks. And this formulation, I think, very much aligns with how we also kind of logically think about the role of monetary policy. So the task at hand becomes, how does one kind of institutionalize this idea that, again, makes a lot of sense within a framework, within a systematic approach to policymaking? And so to do that, we need to come back to these kind of essential ingredients of what kind of underpins our approaches to monetary policy. So the forecasting and policy analysis system that we talked about is really built around answering these three essential questions, as the governor mentioned. First, where is the economy now? Understanding what our starting point is. Second, what are the underlying forces driving the economy? And finally, given that reading and given that assessment of those underlying forces, which includes an assessment of where the key sources of risks and uncertainty lie, what do we need to do with our policy instruments in order to achieve our policy objectives? This is the kind of most essential ingredient of having a forward-looking framework, in the sense that it is in many ways what our entire kind of credibility of our system rests upon. It's how we link the decisions that we're making with our analysis and our reading of the economy and our reading of the risks and areas of uncertainty. And that interconnection, that is kind of the process of communicating all that. That's where the transparency comes in. That's where the importance of kind of high quality communications comes in. So within this kind of broader context is where we kind of move within the framework itself. So to come back to this question of how do we think about kind of quantitative forward guidance, or forward guidance at large within our framework. And so I mentioned the issues that were associated with the baseline scenario itself. And our proposal, again, keeping in mind some of the issues and the limitations of having a singular interpretation, is to rely instead on scenarios-based forward guidance. And the way we construct these scenarios is that rather than representing this kind of most likely future, as a baseline scenario attempts to do, or is conceived of as doing, we instead case scenarios. And so these are not, again, representations of a most likely future in the sense of baseline. They're not multiple versions of a baseline or alternative scenarios, but rather these are illustrative scenarios that serve as examples of policy responses to relevant types of risks and uncertainties. Why is it important that these scenarios are illustrative? Well, as we think about kind of forward guidance, we think that good forward guidance obviously includes an element of both quantitative forward guidance and qualitative forward guidance. That qualitative forward guidance includes things like a narrative-based discussion of the relevant policy issues. And so the scenarios serve as a helpful kind of tool or prop for us to discuss qualitatively these narratives and risks and uncertainties. So the way we structure these case scenarios, they're built around market expectations of the future path of the policy rate, which we glean from data from the markets, and we construct a case A and case B scenario. And a case A scenario reflects one with what Larry Summers has termed hotter economic conditions, where the policy rate path would need to be higher than what's priced into market expectations. The case B scenario is the opposite of that, where we have cooler economic conditions requiring the policy rate path to be lower than what the market is priced in. In certain situations, we may find it useful to also include these what we term case X or Y kind of tail risk scenarios that are primarily about avoiding dark corners. So these might include some of those kind of dark corners that I talked about earlier, such as a high and variable inflation, where there's a risk of inflation expectations becoming de-anchored, or something like a low inflation trap, for example. And so the way we build these scenarios around the market expectations as these illustrative scenarios allows us in our communication and in our forward guidance to have an open discussion of the risks and uncertainties. And this, we think, helps us maintain credibility. And why is that the case? Because the way these scenarios are constructed and the way we develop our narratives that accompany these scenarios is actually intended to reflect very much the process by which decision makers actually arrive at a decision. And this kind of idea of having true transparency in terms of the thinking that leads, again, that third essential ingredient of what are we doing with our policy instruments to reach our policy objectives, this approach, we believe, really helps us do that. Rather than kind of having a single baseline approach where we're really constrained within a singular interpretation, here we're being very open and honest about what the sources of uncertainty are, where we believe the key risks to be, and in making our decision, which types of risks are we trying to manage. And these scenarios serve as kind of helpful props to help us frame that discussion, as opposed to being the kind of primary endpoint of our decision itself. So I'd like to now turn to the process by which we actually operationalize a lot of these ideas within the FPAS Mark II framework. So the typical process by which projections are done and decisions are made in most central banks is typically on a quarterly basis. And so the Central Bank of Armenia, we have 4 quarterly decisions where we go through a full policymaking round. And in between those 4 quarterly decisions, we have what we call kind of interim decisions, where the board makes a decision on the policy rate, but that isn't accompanied by a full kind of projection round. And so this is kind of, we find typically pretty common practice at many central banks. But in terms of how our policymaking cycle works, under traditional formats, the policymaking cycle typically lasts around 2 months, and it becomes a very kind of strenuous exercise, in particular because of how the baseline scenario is constructed as, again, this kind of expert representation of the most likely future. So because we tend to kind of think of these, think of our work more in the context of producing illustrative scenarios where the discussion is about the key risks and the uncertainties, this allows us to significantly streamline a lot of the processes related to the projection round. So our projection round lasts about half the time as is typical, about 29 days or just under a month. And it begins with a kickoff meeting where the board and the staff gather. And this is primarily a meeting intended to get discussion going among board members. So board members are having an open and honest discussion about the current economic drivers, about the major concerns and tail risks, what they find to be the key issues, coming into that meeting and coming into the round. And this is important because we want to give the opportunity under this framework to allow board members to represent their individual ideas, to put forth their kind of interpretations, to talk about what they believe are the key risks that they're trying to manage in the current round. And this is, I think, a very important kind of fundamental principle for our framework. So after this kickoff meeting where, the board has received a briefing from the staff about the current economic conditions, they've had their kind of open discussions about what the current issues are, they then go away and work with a couple coordinators from the staff who help them put together these kind of one-page initial macroeconomic risk assessments where they talk about what they believe are the key kind of issues for them in the current round in the context of the case A and the case B type scenarios. And so the purpose of this really is to get the board members to write down on a piece of paper and through a kind of formal setting the actual what they think are the most important risks. And this is important to get them kind of thinking very early on in the process about the risks themselves and the ingredients that might make up case A and case B scenarios. So the board members, after spending about a couple weeks working on these things, then submit these initial macro risk assessments internally to the chief economist. And the chief economist looks at that information. And of course, throughout this period, the staff themselves have been working on kind of current economic analysis as well. And so in thinking about that, there's kind of been developed this kind of taxonomy or universe of risks and issues that might exist in the current policy round. And that includes some of the input from the members of the board, and that also includes things gleaned from the staff's economic analysis, as well as information that's contained in markets and so on. And so that leads to kind of the scenarios meeting where the chief economist and the staff present to the board what the kind of ideas are for the case A and the case B scenarios. So what are the ingredients and the narratives that make up the illustrative scenarios? The chief economist and staff then go away to actually systematically build out and quantify the scenarios. And throughout this process, the board members, having received all this information through the regular kind of information sharing that's taking place, they then kind of go away and are thinking about, again, these key issues of risk, having kind of impromptu discussions and meetings with other board members and perhaps with the staff as well, to help them kind of get thinking about the key issues. 4 days prior to the decision, the scenarios are locked in. And then when we get to decision day, the decision is then made. So this follows a kind of very robust meeting and discussion among the board members where they're talking about the key sources of risk and the key issues. And then, of course, we move on to the issue of external communication. So we'll touch on that in a little bit. So I understand this this aspect of the framework can seem a bit kind of operational and procedural and in the weeds, but this is important because I think it highlights a number of things. First, this kind of idea that we want to have a lot of kind of open deliberations and thinking and encouraging alternative viewpoints among members of the board. And two, making sure that we're having kind of a lot of touch points and healthy engagements between the board and the staff throughout the process. So how are we actually enhancing the decision-making process by taking this approach? First, by abandoning the baseline, we're eliminating the need to achieve consensus around a single worldview. So naturally, it's very difficult to get decision makers or any group of people to achieve, to have consensus around what's driving the key issues at any given point. And so this approach where we focus on the key sources of risk and uncertainty eliminates that issue altogether. And through kind of some of the specific steps that I outlined, hopefully you can see how this allows us to leverage the brain power of individual board members to give them actual opportunities to present their own ideas and their key issues of risk, rather than having a situation where perhaps their ideas are drowned out by either more powerful or more, more convincing board members. This also creates clear channels for them to express their views, ensure that they're heard, documented, and known, and this helps foster a lively culture of debate and discussion. And so this idea of having this type of culture, this is something that's built over time, and so having that type of institutional setup really helps us make sure that we're putting that culture into place. Now, we spent a lot of time talking about the members of the board. Of course, they're the key decision makers ultimately responsible for making decisions. But the other side of the coin is also equally important. I think many people here would argue that it's more important in the sense that the FPAS Mark II framework, as we've conceived it, really prioritizes a robust investment in human capital development, both in the near and long term among our staff. And this is built on a number of pillars. First and foremost, this idea of training and development being a continuous part of the staff's lives. So this is a fixed part of our workflow. We've trademarked, not officially, but jokingly, this idea of a dynamic learning environment, which is the idea of having really kind of non-hierarchical approaches to learning, of putting people in situations where they're expected to have very high productivity, but also to kind of simultaneously be wearing hats of teachers and students at the same time. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in our session that's devoted to human capital issues tomorrow. We demand of our staff, this is very important, the very highest standards for excellence. This includes world-class economic analytics. This includes things like having critical thinkers, and then having an emphasis on the very highest standards for written and verbal communications. We think it's very important as being an accountable public sector institution. This is something that we mentioned quite a lot, of having staff that really understand and have kind of a sense of mission-driven purpose in doing their work. And in kind of understanding that purpose and the social purpose of the work that they do, that kind of naturally demands that they have the very highest standards for excellence. So that's something that, speaking as a staff member, is something that we demand of each other all the time. We also really prioritize this idea of global engagement among our staff, making sure that as economists, we're engaged with thinkers and leaders from around the world. Certainly, these workshops and conferences are one opportunity for us to do that. We host these on a quarterly basis, but also weekly seminars with some global economic thought leaders. And we've been very privileged to have some very important people participating in these. One of the other kind of really important things is having this ingrained culture of mentorship and feedback. This is, I think, an area where many central banks, but I think large institutions in general really fall short, is creating a culture where mentorship and feedback kind of occur organically. And is something that's kind of an everyday part of our DNA. And so to kind of formalize that, to really kickstart that process, we've introduced a few kind of systematic approaches, including things like a buddy system, which we've adopted, taking some lessons from the Reserve Bank of New Zealand, as well as having regular kind of feedback sharing as a part of our project, kind of a 360-degree feedback approach that's kind of project specific, weekly, monthly, quarterly, and so on. And then, pairing people at the central bank and our staff with mentors from outside the central bank. So people who are seasoned experts in monetary policy and economics and so on. All of this kind of working with these higher standards for ourselves and higher productivity, funnily enough, and perhaps ironically, actually contributes to better work-life balance for our staff. At least that's our idea. It eliminates a lot of the inefficient practices and unnecessary hierarchies that we think tend to stifle a lot of people's kind of upward potential within institutions. And we have this kind of overt emphasis on avoiding burnout among our staff. This also helps us with something that's very important, which is having more equitable hiring practices. So we're very explicitly focused on greater gender equality among our team, but also more geographic diversity for a country like Armenia. Of course, Yerevan's our primate city, so the majority of our people tend to come from the capital or from its universities. And so making an effort to hire people from outside of our traditional geographic sources, and then also tapping into, I think, what people talk about as a hidden source of potential for Armenia, which is our Armenian diaspora. Right. So now to turn to another aspect of the framework, and I'll actually pause here and say that hopefully you'll understand that, or you've been seeing that with the kind of amount or the different types of content that we've been touching upon. We first touched upon kind of quantitative forward guidance, then we switched gears to human capital, and now here we're talking about communications and transparency. This kind of really, I think, underscores the point that the framework itself is quite comprehensive and is quite holistic. It's an overall systematic approach, and we've tried to leave kind of no stone unturned in approaching this framework. So to now come back to this question of communications and transparency, our mission very explicitly, and this is building on a lot of the work that was done with the original FPAS and trying to take this a step further, our mission is to have the very highest standards for monetary policy and transparency and accountability. And so in doing this, we ask the following questions. First, what constitutes the best practice for communications and the highest level of transparency? And two, what is the purpose of transparency? What are we fundamentally trying to achieve, right? And our experience and looking at the experience of others, having done FPAS for over a decade and a half, almost 2 decades, transparency helps us with the following things. One, it helps minimize uncertainty about policy itself. It helps support better informed market expectations. It helps enhance central bank credibility. And it serves as an important foundation for ensuring accountability to the people of Armenia and to our mandate of ensuring price stability. Transparency on its own does not necessarily achieve these things. This isn't a simple kind of input-output model, right? But this is the kind of thing that within a comprehensive framework, if we think about this well enough, transparency can be an important tool that helps us get there. And so how do we think about actually implementing these high standards for transparency and really effective communications under the new framework? So you can see on the screen what we provide as kind of an illustrative segmentation strategy. So the idea being that monetary policy has a number of different stakeholders. This includes, of course, fiscal authorities, financial markets, members of the media who are, largely take on the role of serving as an intermediary between our communications and the public itself. Of course, people in academia and researchers, and finally, and I think very importantly, the general public. And so being able to reach these different audiences, I think, is very important for us, but it requires us to leverage a number of different tools to reach each of these audiences. And so we rely on kind of a comprehensive toolkit for our communications that includes both written, oral, and I would say non-traditional outlets. So this includes things like our monetary policy report and our different types of written communications that accompany each of our decisions. Our decisions are also followed with a press conference, which is something that we've been doing since 2020. Something new that we're introducing under the framework is this idea of a technical briefing that's geared towards technically minded audiences. So these are very technical audiences, members of financial market participants, institutional investors, academics, people that are very kind of interested in the weeds of these things, but that might not necessarily, this might not necessarily attract, of course, for example, the general public or people less well versed in these things. And then finally, for more towards the general public and taking the opportunity for the central bank to communicate directly with the public as opposed to maybe relying on the media to then filter messages, social media can be a very powerful tool. We've seen very, very good examples from around the world of central banks actually using social media as a tool to communicate directly to the public, both first for this question of kind of generally promoting financial and economic literacy and helping people understand what is it that the central bank does, what is monetary policy about, what is our framework, what is inflation targeting, all of these questions, but also kind of more operationally things like, what are our decisions? How did we arrive at these decisions? How are we thinking about key economic questions? So all these ideas, social media gives us a tool to, in rather simplistic and easy to understand language, communicate directly with the public. So we'll be talking actually on this question of society-wide economic and financial literacy initiatives tomorrow morning during our first sessions. We'll be hearing from the governor about this issue of how to develop economic and financial literacy in Armenia more broadly. And then a couple of our board members, Sir Galstyan and Mr. Avagyan, will also be talking about an interesting tool that they've developed, which is kind of an online learning game for improving economic financial literacy, first kind of within the central bank, but also outside of it. So to turn now to our analytical framework. So our analytical framework, we tend to, like I mentioned, I really introduced that caveat very early on in the presentation, which is this idea that we want to be thinking about our analytics and the tools that help us conduct our analysis in a very kind of healthy way. So it's economics first, modeling is a tool to help us kind of structure that economics within kind of a formal setting. Right. So within that, our analytical framework is comprised of first our kind of core models, our kind of quarterly workhorse models that we rely on. And this includes a blend of kind of traditional QPM, as well as our endogenous credibility model. And this model, endogenous credibility, which we term EndoCred, contains a number of interesting things. So first, a number of crucial nonlinearities, first related to the, as the name suggests, the question of endogenous credibility itself in terms of the nonlinearity by which credibility is lost and gained. And second, other nonlinearities, including things like a nonlinear Phillips curve. It also includes an explicit loss function. And then we also emphasize this idea of thinking about the policy implications of parameter uncertainties. We pair these kind of quarterly core models. This is, again, I think, building on a lot of what's common practice under standard FPAS Mark 1 with these satellite models. And a lot of these models are linear models, and they're focused on more specific things like fiscal policy, external shocks, terms of trade shocks, macro financial linkages, and so on. So I now want to turn to this idea of non-traded sticky price inflation, which is something that I promised I'd be talking about. And the reason that we're mentioning non-traded sticky price inflation is that we think that this offers, I think, a really interesting insight, and you'll hopefully get an understanding of what we mean when we talk about kind of economics first and models as a supporting tool, or analytics as a supporting tool for how we think about these things. So when we think about a question like non-traded sticky price inflation, so what is kind of very fundamentally this question of non-traded sticky price inflation? It is, to put it very kind of bluntly and perhaps losing all nuance, an alternative measure for inflation. We tend to think about this rather as a kind of building a better proxy for price stability when we're developing this measure. So the question is, does the world need another measure of inflation? There are certainly many. We've seen, I think, since COVID, I think an exponential increase in the number of alternative measures of inflation. So if we approach this question of trying to come up with an alternative or better or perfect measure of inflation, the answer, of course, is no, we don't need it. But the way we're thinking about this in terms of this idea of developing a better proxy for price stability and putting the economics first, is actually we think that this can provide a lot of value add for us, both internally in our deliberations as well as externally in our communication. So this work really builds on a number of kind of important kind of intellectual underpinnings. And so those underpinnings are, of course, Dornbusch's kind of seminal idea of kind of sticky price overshooting models, as well as new open economy macroeconomics that was developed by Ken Rogoff and Maurice Alpsfeld. I'm not sure if they're in the audience with us today, but they might be. So this idea of, again, building on this. So the way we think about this question of non-traded sticky price inflation, why non-traded and why sticky prices? So this is really built, again, using those new open economy macro underpinnings. This is built on this idea of first thinking about this idea of non-traded prices. For a small open economy like Armenia, it's obviously important for us to be making this distinction when we're thinking internally about this difference between non-traded and traded goods. On the one hand, of course, traded goods are impacted very much by things like the exchange rate. And so having a distinction between traded and non-traded for us is essential, and it makes our communication a lot easier. I think this is actually an issue that Mr. Nurbekin will also be talking about in terms of some of the communication challenges or opportunities that having this kind of analytical and institutional approach under Mark II gives us when we're thinking about talking about projections for our variables like the policy rate or the exchange rate and so on. So when we think about sticky prices, this is the other side of the coin. Sticky prices, of course, the idea behind sticky, and this is really both lifting from Dornbusch, but also from the work that the Atlanta Fed has recently been doing with developing sticky prices. The idea is that because sticky prices, of course, are goods and services whose prices are set infrequently. So because they're set infrequently, the idea is that they would incorporate a degree of forward-looking expectations about future inflation, embody some element of kind of expectations within them, and they would be a better representation of overall kind of generalized excess demand conditions within the economy. So within this context, right, what we do is we think about these ideas of thinking. It's important, one, to be thinking about traded versus non-traded, and two, it's important to be thinking about sticky versus flexible for the reason I mentioned. And so using these ideas, we think about how might we decompose the CPI using this kind of framework and grouping of ideas that we brought. How does this differ from the traditional approach? And the traditional approach is more of a statistical approach to inflation. This is why I'm asking, does the world need another statistical-based kind of alternative measure of inflation? And so where those become problematic is that they take a very kind of statistical and kind of blindly statistical approach to these things, where they try to take out items like unnecessary volatility or looking at things like trim means and so on. And so all of those approaches don't really have the kind of economic thinking driving the idea. It's kind of putting the cart before the horse in many ways. And so here with this idea, we decompose a CPI into these groups of non-traded sticky prices. And then what's left over, right, is this idea of flexible prices. So we're not thinking of, we've excluded the unnecessary or noisy or meaningless items from the CPI, but rather we've developed this grouping. And so when we look at non-traded sticky prices, we can also look at its flip side, which is something like flexible prices, right? And so flexible prices, because they're very quick to change, and they're very much kind of set in individual specific markets, and the prices for specific goods, right, are set in those specific markets, and they're often those prices often change in response to kind of idiosyncratic price shocks that are specific to those markets. When we think about these flexible prices kind of in unison and in aggregate, and when we see them moving in response to what might be generalized excess demand conditions, they can be very helpful for us as economists and as decision makers to be thinking about. Right? Obviously, many price changes in flexible markets, because of those idiosyncratic price shocks, we might not want to be responding to as monetary policymakers. But certainly there is messages and information that's coming through from what we've, quote unquote, excluded from this measure that we still want to be looking at, right? So if we think that price increases in flexible price markets are the result of these generalized excess demand conditions, and we're seeing generalized excess demand conditions taking hold, we certainly wouldn't want to allow those to kind of feed into non-traded sticky prices, right? Because non-traded sticky prices are more reflective of these kind of underlying conditions. They're more reflective of these generalized excess demand conditions. We find that they tend to track pretty well with other of these kind of underlying measures, things like wage growth and so on. And so making sure that as policymakers, we're getting ahead of these things. And when we see generalized excess demand conditions potentially ticking upwards, that we're adequately and appropriately and preemptively responding to those things, kind of perhaps well before they might even bleed into things like non-traded sticky prices. So that's kind of, I hope, kind of gives you a sense of how we think about the analytics under our framework. I will actually pause here and open up the floor to my colleagues if they have any other kind of things to add. But actually, before I do that, let me make a shameless plug as well here. So all of the ideas that we've presented in the presentation that I just walked through, as I mentioned, it was kind of very deliberately all over the place, and I say that I think with a kind of positive twist. All of those ideas are contained within our forthcoming book, which is titled "Prudent Risk Management Approach to Monetary Policy: The Theory and Practice of FPAS Mark II at the Central Bank of Armenia." And so this book contains a very kind of comprehensive assessment of the overall kind of ideas, both theoretical and operational, of the frameworks, just a few of which that we touched upon within this presentation. So you can find an unofficial working draft of this book on our website for the Central Bank of Armenia, that's cba.am, also the Better Policy Project websites, where you can take a look at the unofficial working draft before we publish the full version later this quarter. So thank you so much. I'll now turn it over to my colleagues if they have anything to add, and then we'll open up to the audience for questions.
Yeah, so I just have a small comment about where we are. We're at the DILIJAN Training and Research Center. American University of Armenia is also housed here. They have a graduate program in economics. And so I just wanted to say how special this is. What level of intellectual Athanasio was just here a month ago in December. We have a lot of people working. The governor mentioned some of them, but we also have a research agenda that we think is really important. So maybe the governor could say a few words about some elements of our research agenda, and maybe I'd fill in the rest.
Yeah. So thank you, Doug. Vahe, thank you very much for presenting one piece of the research that is done in DILIJAN Training and Research Center regarding the non-traded sticky prices, which we think is a wonderful measure of what actually central banks should do in terms of managing the excess demand. Besides, I'd like to stress that we're trying here to do something else. And then people who are in the audience and want to jump in and be part of that adventure with us are very welcomed. But regarding the topics of structural macro research that we're planning to do for coming years, I would like to mention topics on migration, which are also, from macro perspective, related to housing as well. There will be a research on technology, AI, related productivity stuff that comes out of it, which I think is a fascinating story. And then we want to have it in-house to research and to understand it better. And the third piece of our research agenda will be about aging, which is also another very important topic, not only for developing countries, but also for much of the developed world. And those are the three. Probably that I'll take a liberty and announce that if there are any other topics related to geopolitical risks, deglobalization, and something like that, we can also include that in our research agenda. But those are the three that at this point I'd just like to highlight. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Governor. So we'll open up to questions from the audience. Yeah, Yuri, go ahead.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. It was very interesting. So I have a question about the scenarios, because you're saying that you're moving away from the baseline, right? One thing that I noticed is that you formulate two scenarios around the current expectations of the market. So either, being more hawkish or more dovish than the current expectations of the market. But then couldn't you say that the current expectations of the market are actually the new baseline?
Yeah. So it's a great question because I think and thank you, Yuri. I think it gives us an opportunity to really explain, I think, a lot of important elements of the framework. So when we think about market expectations and the information they embody, right, in many ways they represent an aggregated view of the market's best guess of what the most likely future is, right? And in that sense, they serve a similar role as what a central bank's central projection might otherwise do, in that they embody from actual market participants or experts this view of how the future is going to unfold, right? And it's that kind of most likely singular view. Where this differs from a baseline and why I wouldn't call this a baseline, while it contains many of the benefits in terms of offering that kind of central view, why I wouldn't call this a baseline is that when we think about the baseline and the folly in the baseline, a lot of that has to do with kind of the operational elements of, one, how the baseline is constructed, which creates a lot of issues, and two, how the baseline is perceived. So in putting forth market expectations, this isn't, one of the issues we have when the baseline serves that role is that this is a central bank communicating a singular interpretation of how that most likely future is going to unfold. Now, whether markets believe and the aggregation of kind of market views suggests that that is, what markets view to be the most likely future is fine. But for the central bank to adopt that kind of singular central projection and put that forth as its view of this is how I believe the future is going to unfold, and you should take lessons from this in terms of how I'm going to act, that all those issues that we brought up in terms of limiting policy agility, in terms of creating this kind of self-imposed constraint on the central bank, those don't exist with that kind of market expectation. So to put it more simply, right, the market expectations provide a lot of the benefits of the baseline scenario without the pitfalls of them being associated with this kind of expert view of that most likely future.